Good evening, and this is the Friday night symposium of the LaRouche organization. I'm Diane Sayre, and before we get to the remarkable speech delivered by Lyndon LaRouche about 31 years ago, just after he had been released from federal prison, where he served 5 years of a really outrageous 15-year sentence on ridiculous charges in a trumped-up case in a court known as the Rocket Docket. But before we get to that, I should just say why this is so relevant now. And the reason is that the financial system of the transatlantic is on the verge of a total collapse. You can get out your buckets and see if you see any helicopters above. The next round of quantitative easing began today. I think they're going to be issuing $40 billion a month to buy treasuries. Basically, they want to increase the number of short-term treasuries. The whole system is insane. Paul Gallagher has been discussing this in a number of places, including this forum with me. The fact that banks are not lending money. People might have noticed that during the pandemic. If you wanted to get a small business loan or a nonprofit loan, the big banks wouldn't lend any money. They are not lending money. They have ratios of something like only 40% of their what's in the bank being loaned out, because the rest of it is being used for speculation, being used for speculative purposes on all kinds of garbage. And we have a bubble of $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives obligations, which cannot possibly be paid. So this has to be let go, and it's better to do it in an orderly bankruptcy as opposed to just having a crash where people lose everything. You want to protect what people need: pension funds, Social Security accounts, or credit funds that go to sewage treatment plants or police departments. You don't want these things to be allowed to collapse. But some guy who was betting what the price of red beans in Singapore is going to be in 2057, I don't know. I don't think we have to save that. If a few people who are billionaires lose so much money that they're only multimillionaires, they will survive. And there's legislation drafted by Paul Gallagher, which we will be circulating in the Congress, calling for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, an orderly bankruptcy reorganization, and a nationalization of the Federal Reserve in terms of creating a national bank for infrastructure and manufacturing, so that the credit can be directed into those things which will actually raise the standard of living, increase the productivity of the workforce. If you do that, you will also discover that the purchasing power of the dollar improves. And you're going to hear a lot more from this from Lyndon LaRouche. Now, otherwise, let me just say we had a remarkable meeting of the International Peace Coalition today. It was joined by Alistair Crook for the first time, and others. It took up the question which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has raised on the national security strategy, and I found it very interesting. Graham Fuller, the other guest, basically said this thing seems to have come out of the blue. Whoever wrote this, does Trump understand? They're really talking about dissolving NATO. The NATO doesn't exist if the United States is not integral to it. And of course, the Europeans are totally freaking out. The Danish Security and Intelligence Services just put out a 60-page report saying that they now consider the United States a national security threat. Now, this is not because Donald Trump is going to grab Greenland, although maybe they're worried about it given what's going on in Venezuela. But this is because they don't know if Donald Trump will be daddy anymore and bail out Europe. Mark Rutte, the Dutch head of NATO, now gave a raving speech yesterday where he literally said that Europeans are going to have to be prepared to fight the kind of war that our fathers and grandfathers fought. Well, if they're talking about a war that their fathers and grandfathers fought against Russia or against the Soviet Union, we know who did that. and it's spelled Nazi. That's who fought the Soviet Union in World War II. Is that what LaRouche is talking about doing? So these people are completely unhinged. Now, there's other material in this national security strategy, which is really ridiculous, outrageous. The South American policy, the idea of containing China. But in a sense, if NATO can be busted up, if it collapses, that is the first step to establishing a new security architecture, as President Putin has been discussing, one which values the legitimate security concerns of every nation, which treats every nation equally, and which protects the security of all. A completely new arrangement, a new system. And if the Europeans don't want to join, then leave them out in the cold. That's fine. They'll come around eventually because they're going to be in a paradigm of zero growth, while Africa moves on to have over 2.5 billion people by 2050. So we are in a remarkable phase change, and part of that has to be that Lyndon LaRouche's voice is amplified and heard. So I'm going to go now to this video, and I think you will absolutely be impressed by LaRouche's wisdom and the fact that I think he got out of jail, I think on January 27th, and this is from February 19th. So it's not even been 1 month since he was released from prison. And I should just say, which I should have mentioned, is that LaRouche is being introduced here by civil rights movement heroine Amelia Boynton Robinson, who had served for some time as the vice chairwoman of the Schiller Institute and had a very close relationship with LaRouche's wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche. And you will hear how she speaks here of Lyndon. So let us now continue.
Has given him more than a reasonable portion of love for every nation, for every country. He has endowed him with more than a reasonable amount of judgment of what to do. The programs that he has made will save the world. It is the only one that we have, for this is a turning point, and this is a man whom God has chosen, Lyndon H. LaRouche.
Here's fine. Thank you very much. It is obviously very good to be here. What I shall say today in chief will be found in more extended form in something which is in the process of publication. When I was released from incarceration and presented with a word processor, it was a second birth of freedom. Actually, it was also a birth of freedom for some of my editors. So what I shall say today is a portion of a much larger report, about 30,000 words, which will be published, I understand, by Executive Intelligence Review in some kind of rational serialization. And thus, you will forgive me if I do not, because of the lack of time, elaborate in full the arguments which you will find elaborated more fully in that written piece. Today, rather than presenting entirely a proof of each and all of the points I shall list, I shall endeavor to present a unified conception of the nature of the proposition, and then leave it to your reflections and later reading to do a further, more full digestion of the details of what I say. The essential thing is to reference is that since approximately 1966, shortly after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the entire world economy, as defined in physical terms of reference rather than some other form of accounting, has been in a process of first declining rate of growth, and then since about 1970, in overall consistent, persisting economic decay, collapse. We have now come to a very advanced stage of that collapse process, and for reasons which I shall indicate here, this is not a cyclical crisis, it is not a boom-bust crisis. The relevant question is not on what day the New York stock market collapses. We are in a condition which in the life of a person is that point of life in which the date of death is uncertain, but the imminence of it is without doubt. This economy, this entire global system of economy, and the institutions with which that economy is associated are in the process of self-destruction. Nothing can save this system. There is no reform. There is no aspirin tablet, no Tylenol, which can give this system freedom from its headaches, except the death to which the system is in any case doomed. The question before us is not whether the system can be saved. It cannot be saved. The question before us is, can the human race survive the passing of the system? Now, the cause of the collapse, in very simple terms, is twofold. The first cause of the collapse of the world economy is what is known to every unfortunate who studies the subject in a university or college as Economics 101. Anybody who believes in that is probably insane. Anyone who teaches it is either a criminal or innocent by virtue of madness. The second cause of the collapse is the combination of Economics 101 with belief in a post-industrial utopia. This was an idea which was kicking around for many years. It was called Malthusianism in former times. It was revived in a very specific form in the 1960s, that is revived in a general publicized form, first by, naturally, Robert Hutchins, who did much of the evil that has been done in this century, out at the Santa Barbara Center for Study of Democratic Institutions. And there was a fellow out there working for Hutchins called Robert Theobald, a kind of a madman, a kook, a quack, who published a book called The Triple Revolution in 1964. His argument was that automation, cybernation, wasn't satisfied with the word automation. He had to use a Greek word. In fact, not really a Greek word, but a sort of a garbaged up Greek word called cybernation. And he said cybernation was filling the warehouses with so much wealth, so many oranges, potatoes, houses, clothes, automobiles, and so forth, refrigerators, and produced by ever fewer numbers of people, that the problem was to create a society in which we stopped cybernation in order to keep at least a few people working, and the rest of the people, being useless, would have to be occupied in some other way by a welfare service industry system. Then there came along, in the same time, there came Robert S. McNamara. Remember the butcher of Vietnam? He didn't care who he butchered, Americans or Vietnamese, as long as he had the body count. Pacifist, you know. Kill everybody and then there will be peace. Robert S. McNamara, who made the Pentagon what it is today, who also was a zero growther, a Malthusian. He introduced systems analysis, which is Robert Theobald's idea, essentially, into the Pentagon. I remember there was one of our guests here told me a joke the other day, which rings in my head. Rang the following day and the day after in the form of a toast. He told about two Russian balloonists who got caught in a storm and were carried over Mount Ararat, and looked down, they saw one man standing on the mountain amidst the clouds, and they asked him, shouted down to him, "Where are we?" And he looked at them reflectively and answered, "You're in a balloon." So one Russian, and probably one who was used to seeing visiting American economists, asked the other, "What was that? Who was that man?" And the other Russian said, "I know he's a mathematician." The second asked why, and he said, "Because his information was precise and useless." You can see why we get some good things out of Russia, you know, jokes like that, we need more of them. But these two ideas combined in the form of things like the cult of environmentalism. I noticed you've noticed the global warming, which has seized us this winter. And the ozone hole, which exists only chiefly in the heads of fools, but which is now made law, and so forth and so on. So the idea of ending a society and economy based on investment in scientific and technological progress, in a society based on the increase of the physical productive powers of labor, was the change to this post-industrial utopia. And the combining of Economics 101, those ideas, with this delusion is the cause for the collapse. Now, we've had two collapses. one in the Soviet economic system, which has occurred essentially in 1989. We are now in the last phase of the collapse of what is called the Anglo-American world system, established at the Versailles Treaty after World War I and consolidated after the collapse of 1971 at various conferences in the 1970s, which established what's called the floating kidney system of world economy, after they got rid of the gold reserve system. Now, in addressing this matter, let me point out to you something that many of you know, but it's relevant, particularly as we go into the world at large and we raise the question of these issues and their remedies. The question today that faces everyone is, given the fact that everyone who teaches economics 101 is either a criminal or a madman, that people who believe it are probably guilty of stupidity, what is going to replace it? Are we going to have everybody on every block come up with a new idea, a new suggestion, try them out with probably equally fatal results? Or do we have to turn to new ideas of a special quality? New ideas which have been proven. And therefore, when any of us speak on the subject of new economic policies, the question is, what's your authority? And therefore, permit me to reference some of my authority, at least the one with which some of you are familiar, to say what I'm about to say. It's been my conviction, on the basis of some work I did in the 1960s originally, it's been my conviction since about 1959, since successfully forecasting the 1957-58 recession and then examining some of the peculiarities of it as it occurred. About 1959, it was apparent to me that a continuation of the Versailles system, post-World War II version, Versailles system economy, as we saw it elaborated in the 1950s under the influence of Arnold Burns, the controller of the economic policy of the Eisenhower administration, that if that system persisted, we were headed during the later 1960s into the outbreak of a succession of monetary crises, which would end up, unless interrupted, in a general collapse, and before the collapse occurred, a turn to the kinds of austerity measures which were imposed on Germany under that Nazi economist Hjalmar Schacht, the man who put Hitler into power with the backing of the head of the Bank of England and with the backing of the Harriman firm in New York City, whose chief executive officer, Prescott Bush, the father of later George Bush president, put Adolf Hitler into power in Germany in 1933 by moving the German funds controlled by the Harriman Bank into the coffers of the Nazi Party in order to overthrow the government of von Schleicher and in order to bring about a condition that is putting Hitler in power, which would ensure their objective, which was a war between Russia and Germany down the pike at that time. That those kinds of economic austerity would be introduced if this policy continued, and that would occur as a part of a process of collapse. This led to, I was no longer a public, I'm not a public figure at that time, nor had any intention of becoming so. But these were ideas which I, as a professional, entertained and enjoyed working on. But then I was warned about what was happening in the form of this Economics 101 plus post-industrial society. And I was convinced in the early 1960s that this was the greatest danger to human civilization, was this kind of brew, which emerged in the United States initially under the rubric of New Left. And so I began coming into public life through teaching and other means in order to fight as an individual by teaching, to try to fight these poisonous, destructive, immoral, worse than Nazi ideas, which were called those of the New Left back then. And I finally found myself in public life and in a lot of trouble. But it became apparent that this crisis was coming. It happened in 1971. The Bretton Woods system collapsed after a burp in 1967-68. The austerity measures of a Nazi type were introduced under Nixon as phase 1 and 2 in 1971-1972. Since that time, the United States physically, in terms of per capita physical consumption, in terms of per household standard of living, in terms of per square kilometer of land area, the United States has been constantly over that period in a constant rate of collapse. Then I had occasion to look at other problems. In the middle of the 1970s, it was obvious to me the following. The world throughout the post-war period, especially from the Pugwash Agreement period of 1958 through 1963, that the world was run by a condominium of two thermonuclear superpowers. A condominium based principally upon the version of Yalta agreements defined or redefined by the Pugwash agreements. Under these agreements, though Moscow and the Anglo-Americans were nominally and in some degree real adversaries, nonetheless, the world was run on the basis of those policies to which the two superpowers agreed. So we had a one world dictatorship in the form of a condominium between putative adversaries. Both systems were infected with each other's problems. The Soviet system, with the defects of communism in it to begin with, was made worse by the influence of what was called systems analysis, which began to become significant during the 1960s and became influential in the 1970s. As part of this, the Soviet and East Bloc economy became entangled with the Western system, such that in effect we had two phases of one global system. And it became obvious to me in the middle of the 1970s that that global condominium, that economic system, was about to collapse, that both systems were headed for a collapse, cross-infected with the sicknesses of both systems of economy. In middle 1970s, I had the occasion to recognize that we were headed under those conditions toward the danger of a thermonuclear war, and that the so-called deterrence program, the Pugwash agreements, the so-called mutually assured destruction policy, was actually the cause of this danger of war. Under Pugwash, the evil people around Bertrand Russell, who were key intellectual authors of the condominium arrangement with Khrushchev and Brezhnev afterward, these people had said, if we eliminate any defense from a global thermonuclear rocket attack, then the danger of obliteration of both superpowers under those conditions of probably expected mutual and assured destruction will mean neither superpower will go to peace. It happened, as I knew, during the middle of the 1970s that the development of thermonuclear pulse effects the electromagnetic pulse effects, made it possible through a limited first assault to prevent the rockets of another power from taking off. And therefore, both powers had to worry about what's called a pin down effect, that they would be unable to respond against a first strike preceded by this kind of assault. At the same time, the rockets were becoming more precise in their targeting. You could almost hit a barrel at a distance of several thousand miles. We can do that today with the aid of these satellite systems. And the rockets were being placed, the strategic rockets, in further advanced positions. Land-based rockets were being placed in Europe, aimed at Soviet positions. Soviet boomers, submarines carrying strategic rockets off the Pacific and Atlantic coast of the United States, could deliver a pin-down effect within a matter of minutes from time of launch. So we are into a situation where the commanders of the forces on both sides had to be prepared for the danger of a first strike, in which they would have no more than a couple of minutes warning before they would launch their counterstrike. Extremely dangerous situation. It was also obvious to me, as it was obvious to the relevant Soviet officials, such as Sokolovsky, back in the 1960s, that the idea of intercepting a thermonuclear rocket with a high-speed interceptor rocket was a piece of nonsense. Strategically, it could not be done. It was obvious to the Soviet military back as early to middle 1960s that only new types of weapon systems could stop a thermonuclear rocket barrage. These were called later in the 1972 Ballistic Missile Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Weapons Treaty. They were called systems of defense based on new physical principles. It was obvious to me in the 1970s that both of the powers had this capability in the process of development. And I, by 1977, was advocating the development by both powers under agreement, these new types of systems of so-called new physical principles as strategic global defense systems that is in the process of development against the kind of first strike danger, which as a danger could impel the world into a general thermonuclear war almost by accident. It was also my view at the time that this could not be done strategically, because we're dealing with adversary relations, except by mutual agreement. That this could not be done economically without agreement to use these same technologies to increase the productive powers of labor of the economies of both superpowers and other nations. Then there came, in that context, this was, of course, as many of you know, my policy in the 1980 Democratic presidential primary campaign. Then there came a point at the December of 1981 when high-level agencies of the United States government asked me to open up a back channel to the Soviet government. And it was agreed that if I would accept that undertaking, that I would be free to do it as I saw it, though I would transmit messages from my government. And it was agreed that I would present to the Soviet channels my proposals, 3-point proposals, to utilize new physical principles for a strategic defense system, to recognize the economic, technological benefits to the economy of such a program, and to agree to cooperation, economic and technological cooperation in this connection. So as beginning February 1982 through February 1983, I engaged with a senior diplomat, Soviet diplomat in Washington, with such a back channel discussion, which was turned down by General Secretary Andropov in at least no later than February of 1983. But this comes to the point. The Soviet government agreed on the first 2 points, agreed on the new physical principles, and agreed on the economic benefits for civilian economy of using these technologies for civilian as well as military purposes. They agreed that cooperation would work, but they said they would refuse the cooperation, first of all, because the United States in a crisis program would beat Russia, and secondly, because they would not make any such agreement with an adversary power under the Soviet Constitution. I replied to that at the time. I said, if you attempt to do what you say you're going to do, you'll develop the systems yourself. Your economy will collapse within about 5 years because it cannot take that kind of strain. And as many of you know, in the same period in 1983-84, I forecast in the national television broadcast I made an impending bank collapse beginning that year within the US banking system, and indicated this banking collapse was a portent of a general collapse of the US economy if we did not radically change our policies. So if you look at that material over that period, there is nothing unusual in my claim to some degree of unique expertise on the subject of the intermingled collapse of the two superpower systems, the one which has already collapsed and the collapse of the Anglo-American international financial economic system, which is now in accelerating progress toward a collapse which can occur any day or might be postponed for some months. But nonetheless, we are in a terminal state of collapse. And the longer it takes for the collapse to occur, the worse it will be for humanity. Now let's look at several aspects of this to see how this collapse was brought about. It was brought about not because of any natural condition, not because nature decreed it, not because there is any law that the collapses must occur. The idea that there must be cyclical cycles and boom-bust cycles in economy is a complete piece of nonsense. There is no necessity for the occurrence of such under a sound economy, such as that form of economy presented by Leibniz at the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th, the founder of the science of physical economy, and also presented as US policy in the Article 1 of the US Federal Constitution, as elaborated by such figures as US Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, as elaborated also by Friedrich List, and as adopted by the great Russian statesman of the turn of this century, Count Sergei Witte. If that system is used, there can be no economic system of collapse, boom, bust, nor any system of collapse. The collapse lies entirely with a choice of economic policy, number one, and secondly, into successfully enforcing that economic policy. You can sometimes have a bad policy, but if nobody pays any attention to it, they might survive. If you're able to enforce the policy, they're doomed. Which is why every reform which tries to make our policy, US policy, more effective results in nothing but worse results. To look briefly at what the problem is. Physical economy, or the science of economy, was established at the end of the 17th century, in the beginning of the 18th century, when the ideas of political economy did not exist in England. Political economy came to England after 1763, about a century after it came to France, and about 3/4 of a century after it came to parts of Germany. What we had is in 1763, one of the most evil persons in modern times, the second Earl of Shelburne, called William Petty, came to power in England following the success of Britain in defeating France as a maritime power. France remains still the largest land power, the most advanced economy in the world, the most advanced science of any nation in the world, far more advanced than any competing nation, and had the largest economy and the most successful one in the world. But as a maritime power, Britain defeated France as a naval power, as a maritime power, through the war, which ended in 1763. Into this mess emerged a fellow called William Petty, the second Earl of Shelburne, whose ancestors had founded the evil Bank of England. Shelburne had two characters who are most famous in his employ. One was probably the Jeremy Bentham, who is reputed to be the illegitimate father of Satan. And the second one, who had not been a spiritual eunuch, might have qualified for the position, Adam Smith. Now, the Smith family biography records a carriage ride with William Petty, the second Earl of Shelburne, and Smith, and Smith. Smith had just been employed by Shelburne. And the biography records the essentials of that conversation. Shelburne instructed Smith that he was to work on developing measures with two objectives. One, to destroy the economy of France. Two, to destroy the economies and independence of the chartered English-speaking colonies in North America. In 1776, Smith, after meeting with the friends of Satan, i.e. Voltaire, in the continent of Europe, came back and published a book, which was largely plagiarism, but nonetheless he published it. It's called The Wealth of Nations. This was the poison which Lord Shelburne had demanded be developed to destroy the economy of France and to destroy the economies and independence of the English-speaking colonies of North America. And to a large degree, it worked. In 1783, at the peace treaty in Paris, which settled the recognition of the independence of the United States of America, both France and the representatives of the United States committed a foolish act. They negotiated with the Prime Minister of England, who at that time was Shelburne, to accept free trade as a condition of the peace. As a result of this, between 1783 and 1789, the economy of the United States went bankrupt. In 1789, the economy of France went bankrupt for the same reason. In the United States, Washington, Franklin, others, including Hamilton, created a new constitution which rejected absolutely the dogmas of free trade as being the poison injected by an enemy power, Britain. Article 1 of the Constitution is specific on that. Then in 1789, a bankrupt United States established a new federal government with Washington as the president and Alexander Hamilton as the Treasury Secretary. Under Washington and under the leadership of Hamilton, a Bank of the United States was established. The public credit of the bankrupt United States was restored. And a prophetic policy outlined in a paper called On the Subject of Manufactures was issued. A prophetic policy which proposed the successful transformation of the United States economy from a predominantly rural one, in which 90% of the population was employed in rural agriculture, that is, 90% of the people had to work just to keep the rest fed, to an industrial economy of great power and increasing productivity. The entire success of the United States is based on the implementation of these ideas, which Hamilton outlined as the anti-British American system of political economy, a system of economy based upon scientific and technological progress, on energy intensity, on capital intensity, and on science driver principles. This was a success, as some may have noted, as opposed to those who would be called colonies who accepted the British system of free trade. Thus, there is no question that prior to 1763, since the American system was based, including the Declaration of Independence, including the Constitution, were based on the principles enunciated by Leibniz almost a century earlier, that there existed a system of workable political economy prior to 1763, prior to Adam Smith's employment by Shelby. And I can put it to you that as far as Economics 101 are concerned, that the economic theory underlying the collapse of both the Soviet system and the presently ongoing collapse of the Anglo-American world system are the result of the anti-Leibniz ideas introduced beginning 1766 by Shelby through the mouth of Adam Smith. The free trade system is what has caused this collapse. I shall just recently refer to a number of economists who represent this system. They are Adam Smith, David Ricardo, the student of Smith and Ricardo, Karl Marx, and for a modern reference point, the mathematician, again, I was thinking of our friends and Russians in the balloon over in Mararat, John von Neumann. All of these represented, as von Neumann accurately described, the mathematics of Smith, the mathematics of Ricardo, and also the mathematics of Karl Marx's three-volume Capital, especially volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. They are all zero-sum games. In fact, as von Neumann insisted quite rightly, any system based on a set of so-called linear inequalities is a zero-sum game. In fact, it is what we call entropic. That means it starts at its best time and degenerates from there. So what has happened in effect, as I shall indicate, is because we used a theory of economics which is zero-sum, which means it makes no allowance for real growth, at least in its formal aspects, and because in its formal aspects it is intrinsically entropic. The application of an entropic theory to tightly administer an economy must result in an entropic, i.e., a collapsing economy. That's what Economics 101 will do for you. When you add a second feature, sabotage, discouraging of investment in scientific and technological progress, when you oppose energy intensity, when you oppose capital intensity, when you oppose relatively massive investments in public infrastructure, all in the name of post-industrial utopia, when you oppose also the development of the cognitive powers of students through a grounding in education and geometry and in classical humanist methods of education, you produce a population which could not implement technological progress even if it were the policy of government to do so, because they just refuse to allow them to learn. And that's what's happened. We have combined economics 101 with a determination to destroy the developing sector, especially since 1971, with a determination to rid ourselves of the useless eaters of our welfare and service industry employed population, to reduce the birth rate, which temporarily lowers the cost of labor, but plays hell with getting your pensions paid. And then now, with health caps on health care, to start committing Hitler-style genocide against people over 55 as a way of reducing the average cost of health care per capita of the population. These are the ideas which brought us into this mess. Let's look at the question of profit. Before 1763, and in the American system afterward, we had an idea of profit. Now, profit means, when you look at an economy physically as a whole, it means essentially that society consumes so much wealth in the form of household consumption, in the form of producers' consumption, in the form of maintenance of infrastructure, that as a result of consuming this wealth, through the process of production using technological progress to increase the productive powers of labor, we produce more wealth than we have consumed. That margin of increase is real profit, which is the same thing as growth. And we mean a growth in productivity of this type per capita, but since people who work are members of families and are produced by families, it has to be also per household. It also must be per square kilometer of land used at the rate of not only the amount of wealth produced, but the rate of production of wealth must increase. This was well understood by Leibniz. Thus, when you're talking about an economy, a physical economy, consistent with what Leibniz or I would argue, you're talking about a kind of economy which looks very much like an evolutionary model of the biosphere. That the biosphere is producing ever higher orders of organization, very much like the Mendeleev periodic law portrays the star's production of a higher state of organization of its component parts. And the higher the level of the star system, presumably the larger the periodic table, so to speak. So this is, let's call it an evolutionary model, corresponding to what we mean by evolution, upward evolution in living systems, or what Nicholas of Cusa, in defining evolution as a concept of Christianity back in the middle of the 15th century, described in a work called Visione Dei, the image of God. That man, in his economy, through scientific and technological progress and through progress in fine arts, has an effect on the form of society, the conditions of individual life, of family life, which is an upward evolution comparable to upward evolution in evolutionary living biospheres, living processes. In fact, the development of fundamental discoveries has a similar pattern. Thus, an economy under this influence, again, the influences of ideas that we use to control our physical behavior, determine the general pattern of result. If you use an entropic idea and you impose that entropic idea efficiently upon an economy, you'll get a collapse. What you really intended to do, whether you knew it or not. If you can find out how to impose a not entropic model on an economy, one which conforms to upward evolution and living processes, then you will get a happy result. Not happy for some of our environmentalists, but happy for real human beings. Or people who are card-carrying human beings, shall we say. This is only possible through scientific and technological progress and through cultural progress. There is a similar case to be made for the development of the fine arts in modern times, especially in what is called the classical form of music. It's not true of the romantic or other forms, but in the classical form we can show occurring through people like Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Schumann, and Brahms, and also the great Dvorak, who came here to uplift the African-American spiritual. We can find this same pattern of creative development following exactly the same lawful pattern as fundamental scientific progress in the domain of the physical sciences. If we look at the history of mankind in particular, just to skip ahead a bit to a detour, which is relevant to this, man has existed on this planet for at least about 2 million years, according to the best knowledge we have. When man came into existence on this planet, from a standpoint of the ethnologist, the animal ethnologist, man had about the cultural potential of a baboon, a weak baboon, without the killer capabilities of a real live Abyssinian baboon, for example, or a South African variety carrying all these nuts from the baobab tree. So man would have a somewhat inferior chance of existence unless he had a brain, which a baboon doesn't have. What we know of mankind's development is limited to really the period since the melting of the ice. As we approach the present interglacial period, which we're now living, which I must warn you is coming to an end a few thousand years from now. So be careful where you buy real estate. But we can also say that there were not great landmarks left behind from an earlier period. You know, the oceans are probably down to 200 or 300 feet or more below their present level. That mankind, if he existed in any important condition, say 40,000 years ago, must have existed pretty much as a maritime culture, which would be associated with fishing and living on coasts, and most of those areas today would be submerged. But nonetheless, we can say with some degree of certainty that mankind in the first 2 million years of his existence on this planet, as we might estimate it today, didn't make a very impressive dent on the physiognomy of our planet. But we can also say, knowing a great deal increasingly about the past 6,000 or 7,000 years of man's existence, and knowing something significant about man's existence over the past 15 to 20,000 years through archaeological indications, we can say that in the past 6 centuries, since about 1400 to 1450 AD, the development of mankind on this planet exceeds the entirety of the development of mankind in 2 million years preceding. The power of man to survive, the power of man to increase the standard of living of households, the power of man to increase the productivity and mental existence of the individual person has increased perhaps more than in all the preceding existence of the human race. This power we know first as the development of science. We also know in a complementary way as the development of art, as typified by the work of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and by the development we associate with Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, and so forth. This is the greatest period in all human existence, which is spoiled by these kinds of things which are typified by Economics 101. So we have demonstrated in the past 600 years a principle which is always there, the principle of man's capacity for creative development, for precursors of what we would call in modern times scientific and cultural development. But we have never seen such an efflorescence of that power of man to walk in the image of God as we have seen in the past 6 centuries, radiating from Europe into the growth of population throughout this world, not just in Europe, as a result of the proliferation of this scientific and cultural development, including such simple things as sanitation and so forth, to enable life expectancies to be increased. So we know from this that we as mankind have the power of ever increasing scientific progress to apply to our problems in such a way as to transform the way in which we produce things, to increase the standard of living physically, per capita, per household, and per square kilometer. We also know that mankind today is on the verge of colonizing, as well as exploring what we call nearby space. We know that the destiny of man, if we survive this crisis and learn our lessons for it, is unlimited in the universe. It makes no difference to us now what man will do 500 or 1,000 years from now. I'm worried about the next 200, but 500 or 1,000 years from now. We know that the available course of activity of mankind is upward, if we but determine to learn from our experience of the past 600 years and to apply that experience to create, again, a model of society which is not entropic, a model which emphasizes the growth of scientific knowledge, of artistic creativity, and of investment in increasing the productive powers of labor and the education of our children. Then if we do that and do that effectively, we have unlimited, not entropic growth of mankind, not merely on this planet, or shall we say this home planet, but in the universe at large. That is profit. It's the only kind of profit worth talking about, is to have enough to produce today more than we consume today, to have something to invest in the future for tomorrow, to invest in the progress of science, education, care of people, and culture, and thus to increase the productive powers of labor, so that those we tomorrow and those that come after us will be more productive in the next generation than we in ours. That is our imperative. That's our duty. And that we can call profit, or the margin of profit, and the productive investment of that margin of profit. That is what Leibniz understood. That is what I have always understood since I understood fully Leibniz in this respect. The problem then is to eliminate thinking which is based on entropic ideas. The problem there is that mathematics, as it is taught in a form which is intrinsically entropic, which does not mean it's useless. It describes space-time very usefully, but it does not encompass the full scope of anything and cannot represent in its present form that which is most characteristic of our species, the not entropic processes of creative discovery and the application of creative discovery to the human condition in our practice. No formal linear mathematics can do that. There's nothing wrong with the mathematics as mathematics It's when you impute to it something that is not there. Mathematics of that form cannot describe by axiomatic definition what happens in creativity. What is called statistical negentropy by people like Theobald and others, or Wiener, today is not anything except a reversal of entropy. It has nothing to do with life. It has nothing to do with the development of creative ideas. It has nothing to do with the communication of creative ideas. So we should put mathematics ordinary mathematics, where it belongs, as a tool, but a tool which does not comprehend man, a tool which does not comprehend living processes. And we must raise ourselves to a higher level, as great Georg Cantor indicated, among others, to a higher level of conceptualization, which permits us to efficiently address these kinds of processes. But in the meantime, even with an imperfect mathematics, we can represent a phenomenon which the mathematics itself cannot describe. We can represent the effects of a not entropic process in statistical procedures and economics, something I do all the time, I assure you, and I enjoy it very much. What we must concentrate upon, as Helge has said, we did not consult on this matter, but it's the same thing. We must concentrate on the development of man. This is the problem we face, don't we? People believe in Economics 101. The economy is collapsing because of Economics 101. Don't you think we ought to do about the mind, something about the mind of that poor stoop who believes that nonsense? People who watch MTV on television. People who listen to some of this junk they call music these days. All of this stuff. People, the problem is that our people have become stupid. They don't know their opinion. I used to say, as I said on a recent press conference, I used to say to people in prison, you want to tell me your opinion? You, who were arrested for buying dope from a government sting agent to sell to a bunch of snitches, you're not a drug pusher, you're in here for criminal stupidity, and you want to tell me about your opinion. The problem is the opinions of people are our problem. The opinions of people are wrong on two counts. First of all, Americans are other directed. No self-respecting American ever reveals that he has a mind of his own. He gets his opinions from authoritative sources, like the television news, like watching Hollywood movies. He gets his ideas on sexual relations by watching MTV. He has no independent opinions. He borrows his opinion, as Reisman said, he's another directed fellow. He borrows his opinions from his neighbors. When he sits and somebody asks him, what's your opinion? He goes like this and like that. And he sees what they're saying around him. The thing on which we have to concentrate once we address these kinds of problems is to recognize the failure of mankind to recognize the evidence which exists, which should have guided it to reject certain ideas and which should have guided it to seek out the correct ideas and to recognize them. And as Helge said, what we have to concentrate on is to attack the educational system which is destroying our people and to install in place the kind of education which trains young people for creativity. Now, if you cannot represent creativity by a mathematical formula, how do you represent it? Let's take, first of all, the simple case of physical science, and then let's look just for comparison to the case of classical music. How do we educate a child properly? How did Gerd Grote, Thomas à Kempis, and so forth, in the Brothers of the Common Life and in similar educational programs of that period, how do they take mankind in Europe at his lowest point, the point of a so-called new dark age, the new barbarism of the 14th century? And how, out of this circumstance, did we produce a group of people who formed what is called the Golden Renaissance, as typified and centered in Florence around the famous Council of Florence. How did we found in that period in the early 14th, 15th century, following the darkest period in European history since the fall of the Roman Empire, how did we unleash the greatest period in the existence of man during the past 600 years, despite all the things that are happening to us today? It was done by people who were properly educated. How were they educated? First of all, they were fortunate. They had no textbooks, especially Economics 101. What they were compelled to do and what they taught was what we would call today original sources. They were taught original discoveries in geometry. Limited, but they were taught them. What they did was to instruct a child to do what a child will do naturally if given the opportunity to do so. To re-experience the act of discovery as that act had been produced earlier within the mind of the original discoverer or someone like that. So the child, instead of learning formulas, instead of learning formal logic, instead of learning deduction and induction, the child went through a process of rigor of actually re-experiencing in the child's own internal mental processes the experience of the original discovery. That doesn't mean you don't use mathematics and other things to induce that event within the child's mind. But the thing is, the child did not learn to conform to a formal model of an idea. The child learned to generate that idea by learning how to cope with a paradox, which is rigorously defined, and to see the answer to that paradox. What I've used often to exemplify that kind of discovery is the case of Couza's discovery of non-algebraic mathematics in his treatment of the Archimedean paradox of squaring the circle. It's a precise example of the two issues of rigor, of scientific method, but also of a certain naive development in enabling a child to replicate in the child's own mind, in this case, what happened inside the mind of Nicholas of Cusa to make this fundamental discovery of modern physical science. The child can replicate that in the child's mind. There's no way of putting that discovery in words in a way which bypassed the obligation for that kind of replication. Now, if we educate children to re-experience discoveries, then the child's mind is populated with a collection of people. Over that corner is Pythagoras. Over there is Plato. Over there is Cusa. Over there is Leibniz. And each of them, as we come to modern times like Leibniz, well, there are a lot of Leibniz moments up there. Leibniz made a lot of discoveries. And there are a lot of Leibniz movements. There are Kepler moments. There are Leonardo da Vinci moments. In your own mind, there is Leonardo da Vinci in the child's mind, because the child has re-experienced that moment of creation of an idea which occurred in the mind of Leonardo by replicating the same experience. Now you ask that child, what do you mean by discovery? The child has a mind which looks somewhat like that famous mural in the papal apartments in the Vatican, the famous School of Athens of Raphael. There are all those people in his mind. You can almost see their faces, but you can hear them think. In those moments, you ask the child, what's creativity? The child says, well, it's thinking as did these people. And the child, if the child reflects and grows up a little more and becomes reflective, the child will think back and adduce from that certain principles of creativity and reduce these to types. As a matter of fact, the easiest way to understand this process is from the great tragedies, such as those of Aeschylus, say the Prometheus, for example, the first surviving part of that trilogy. or from the great tragedies of Shakespeare, or from what is really a tragedy, the Don Quixote of Cervantes or of Schiller. That the fact that the consciousness looking at consciousness, the soliloquist on the stage who speaks to the audience is speaking of the consciousness of the actors within the play. The audience is aware of the consciousness of those actors and becomes conscious of the soliloquist's consciousness. The playwright sitting in the balcony is already conscious of the characters in the play and of the soliloquist. He's looking at the consciousness of the audience in watching the play. And when we imagine that kind of picture in classical tragedy, we can understand exactly what goes on in the mind of a child who has been properly educated. The ability to be conscious of his own and other people's consciousness, and to get knowledge, not knowledge of things, that's important, but essentially knowledge of the process by which the human mind makes discoveries and determines which of those discoveries are valid or not. And determines also how to communicate these discoveries to other minds so that mankind can communicate. How to transform these discoveries into objects, such as crucial experimental apparatus. How to take that crucial experimental apparatus to a machine tool shop and fabricate a machine tool principle, which multiplies the productive powers of labor in many facets of life and of labor as a whole. What we have to do essentially is that, first, we must get rid of Economics 101. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and John von Neumann. Get rid of it. It is what is destroying us. Secondly, get rid of another axiom. Get rid of the axiom of post-industrial society, of zero growth, which is entropy. Eliminate that. Turn the human spirit free. Go back to the ideas of physical economy, as Leibniz encapsulated them, as I've devoted a lifetime to that issue. Apply this model of a science driver economy in which the state takes responsibility for a banking system, for a credit system, and for making sure that either public or private agencies provide sufficient basic economic infrastructure. And an efflorescence of ideas in the practice of manufacturing, distribution, agriculture, and so forth. Provide credit at low prices to each of these, whether state or private enterprises. Have objectives, as de Gaulle understood this principle. Have objectives. What does society need to do? What are the priorities? State them. What's going to work? What creates a balance? Let society know about that and tell people to get out there and do the best they can to realize these objectives. If we do that thing with an understanding of this comparability of the evolution of economy in its positive form to the evolutionary principle of the biosphere, then we can, instead of using the zero growth model, using that with some understanding of the details of it, we can succeed. But we will only succeed if at the same time we educate the children, to educate them in science and in art. Let me just indicate in the case in music. We will deal again here tonight, I believe, with a discovery in music on which all modern classical music, in the proper use of the term classical, which means through Brahms and includes Dvorak, is based. It's a discovery which was made in first approximation by Haydn, and then in a higher level by review of Bach by Mozart, right after that, which is developed further by Beethoven in a way in which the last years of his life was absolutely unsurpassed. There is probably no musician who ever lived who approaches the pure genius of Beethoven in the last 10 years of his life. Nothing to match it in all music. Nothing that even approaches it. The only thing you have is this great man afterward, Brahms, who does all this wonderful work to help you understand what had been accomplished up to that point in a richer way. But the thing to understand is this: all of these great musicians studied the creative discoveries of the other great musicians. That's what a good musician is. A good musician learns a discovery which is made, or at least is reflected for the first time in Florence in the first half of the 15th century. It's called bel canto, singing. And that was a discovery. The musician who does not make that discovery will be crippled as a musician, defective for the rest of his life. That imposes other discoveries. You discover how, when you use bel canto method, you discover how the voice is organized. You learn it has registration. You learn there are different species of voice which are precisely defined. That's a discovery. You have to learn that discovery. Then you go to another discovery. You discover how to put these voices together, the singing voices together. And you find there are about 6 potential species of these singing voices. So 5-part and 6-part counterpoint is the most natural expression of the desire of human beings to sing poetry. You learn that music comes from poetry. That when you have classical poetry, even our most ancient ancestors say the Vedic hymnists of Central Asia at 6000 BC, they sang a poem before them. Each vowel had a relative pitch. And reading the poem, they could sing it. They do to this day. They sing their poetry. From this, by singing poetry in different species of voices, utilizing different registrations of each species of voice, you have this wonderful development of counterpoint, which defines a 24-key, well-tempered system. A discovery, but it was always there. Because the natural condition of man determines that human beings have these natural potentialities, and it's our duty to discover them. Then Haydn, working from the Italians and from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the son of Johann Sebastian Bach, made a discovery and introduced to musical composition, a coherence which had never existed in music before. A systematic coherence. And then he had this young fellow, Mozart, who participated with him in certain important discoveries. And Mozart, having the opportunity to work through Johann Sebastian Bach, made other discoveries. A revolution. From 1781, 1783, 1786, the discoveries by Mozart in music are a tidal wave, which properly understood beyond imagination. The only thing comparable to that is what Beethoven did in the last 10 years of his life, which surpasses it. These are discoveries. You read Brahms, read the Jenner book, where the student of Brahms, Jenner, wrote a book on his conversations, relationship with Brahms. Read Brahms's instructions to Jenner in that book. Discover, discover, discover. This is not textbook music. You cannot learn music from a musical textbook. You can get some guidelines of what you have to learn, but you must learn classical music step by reliving each of the discoveries which is involved, which is the way you teach it to children, by teaching them to sing. You learn then the instruments, because the instruments, as Bach says, you must teach your instrument to sing, which means you must have the singing idea in your head, and you must force your instrument to sing as a human voice. Not human because it's an instrument made of steel and wood, but because it's an instrument in the hands of a human being. And it must sing. Every musician must learn this. So that we see, when you think about music, don't think about entertainment or some fool jigging on the beach. Think of the greatness of music. Think, as you probably have, some of you have noticed, the work of Dvorak with Harry Burleigh. That was discovery. The spiritual was never the same after that, because its potentiality was discovered by applying principles which are the accumulated knowledge of music of centuries, was embedded in that relationship and that process. Think of things in that way, and then you see music is not entertainment. Music involves precisely, with the most demanding, in the most demanding way, of the individual who wishes to become a professional musician, a good one, demands precisely in the most intense degree the same kind of training and intensity as the greatest physical scientist. There's been a folly popularized. It was popularized by an evil man, Kant, and then repopularized in the 19th century by another evil man called Savigny, who said in German that you must separate Geisteswissenschaft from Naturwissenschaft. That art and science in particular are separate things. They have no relationship to each other. But on the contrary, the person who says that knows nothing of either science or art. Because the same creative principle, which we find reflected in the great achievements of science, which we find emblazoned in the accomplishments of our past 600 years, which surpass everything done by mankind in the millions of years before. The principle of creativity, the same principle, the principle which marks man as in the image of God by virtue of these gifts of creative powers. That same principle is the essence of science, it's the essence of great music. So we must educate our children in science. We must educate every child as if to become a great scientist by letting them relive the emotional experience as well as the learning of the great discoveries of their predecessors, which are precious few, actually. And let them learn in a similar way by learning first to sing poetry as little children. Let them learn step by step the creative accumulation, which is music. And they will learn poetry, they will learn drama, they will learn the history of mankind, and they will be, above all, able to look into the eyes of a stranger and see through those eyes, within that body, in the motion of that mind within, the reflection of an individual person in the living image of God. Thank you.
Sorry about that. That was Lyndon LaRouche just 3 weeks after he had served 5 years in prison. You hear what was on his mind and the question of recognizing the distinction absolutely between human beings and animals. And of course, your economic policy is what has to reflect that and make it possible for human beings to develop their talent. So if you want to see that again, the LaRouche organization will be streaming it at 7 p.m. Or of course, you can watch this video again. And that's it for this evening. And we'll see you soon.